no one's got it all figured out, or they would be gobbling up all the papers and be very rich. So, I think a lot of it has to do with being willing to experiment, but also understanding your core business and, serving your audience and your customers, your advertising customers, if you're an advertising-based business.
This is Small Press, Big Ideas, a podcast about the business of local news in the United States. I'm your host, Paul Gewertz. Small Press, Big Ideas is about the opportunities and challenges that local news publishers are facing for their businesses. I'll sit down and talk with journalists, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, and more in the local news industry to find out what's working, what isn't, and how the local news ecosystem can innovate and flourish in the 21st century. Okay, today on the podcast, I'm joined by Tim Regan-Porter. Tim is the CEO of the Colorado Press Association, and he's also the host of the Local News Matters podcast, which, if you're listening to this podcast, you would probably enjoy that one too. I was listening to that before I launched this one, so I'm a fan. Tim, thanks for coming on. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, cool. So I did a very brief intro there. I'd love to just hear your story in your own words, just a quick bio on your life and your career in the local news biz and what brought you to being at the CPA, Colorado Press Association.
Yeah, I've had really multiple careers, kind of professional ADHD. I was following wherever my interest and where I thought I could do the most good. So I started in tech in the early days of the web. I was helping companies get their business online and integrated with back-end systems at IBM and a couple startups. And then in the early 2000s, launched a music magazine with some friends and got a magazine called Paste, and did a combination of things there from editorial to running the business side. And that did really well. And but we ended up selling it shortly after the Great Recession, and get recruited to start the Center for Collaborative Journalism at Mercer University, which was one of the first groups in the country to try what Knight started pushing, the teaching hospital model, if you don't count Mizzou, whose claims that goes all the way back basically to their founding. And so we was a partnership between the university and the McClatchy paper there in Macon and public radio and a TV station. And we were collaborating amongst the media partners, but also training students how to do journalism by embedding them in the community and in the newsrooms. And from there, we did the JSK Fellowship at Stanford and got recruited by McClatchy to run a few newsrooms in the South, and then came out to Colorado.
Excellent, yeah, and we welcome you with open arms. I say that as a Colorado native, which is kind of rare these days.
Thank you.
What can you tell me about your role? I listen to your podcast, so I don't come from a journalism background, really. So when I hear press association, I have kind of a vague idea of what goes on there. I know how they kind of serve local publications, but I'd be curious about just what your role as CEO of the Colorado Press Association entails and what work you guys are doing there.
Sure. So the Press Association is the trade group for predominantly print and digital only outlets. Broadcasters have their own association. And each state, although there are some combined states, each state in the U.S. has one, and they all operate a little bit differently, but there are some common themes. So we do, I describe three legs of the stool that is the Press Association. One, we do legislative advocacy on issues that relate to journalism and newsrooms. So that's everything from open records and open meetings and trying to defend those and push for more transparency, to advocating for sometimes things that are in financial interest or things that would hurt our financial interest. And there are all sorts of bills that come up that either implicate the press intentionally or unintentionally, or that we are pushing for things. So, like one of the examples I give is in California, when they were passing a law to really address how, Uber drivers and others were treated, that ended up getting newsrooms caught up in that because of delivery drivers for newspapers, and that's a very niche thing that most people don't think of. So they had to go back and amend the law because it was decimating that, which has its own little economic model. So we deal with all sorts of things on the advocacy front. And then we sell advertising into newspapers and sometimes a little broader than that. But when a large company like Xcel Energy wants to be in 150 newspapers throughout the state, they don't want to deal with 150 salespeople.
Right.
So we handle all that for them. And then the third leg is as member training and networking, and we do a big annual convention every year.
Awesome. Very cool. And Colorado, it's funny. I happen to be in Colorado. Like I said, I don't know how many times I've said this on the podcast. I don't come from a journalism background. But I was I started working with some local publishers a few years ago and then got more and more interested and then started this podcast and et cetera, et cetera. Here I am, like, head down in this space all the time now. I was kind of surprised to learn that Colorado is, I don't know if I want to call it a hotbed for local news, but it seems like there's a lot of activity here. I know there's Collab. There's some really cool examples of what is it? Colorado Sun, I believe, is a website that popped up years ago that before I was interested in any of this stuff, I always thought did really good work and everything. So I'm just curious on your take why that is, and if I'm off there, is it a hotbed? Is there a lot of activity here compared to other states, or just what are your thoughts on that?
It absolutely is a hotbed. It is known in throughout the country for those involved in the space as one of the more innovative and collaborative ecosystems. And there are a handful of states I could point to, but Colorado is definitely up there in the top. And why that is, there are lots of factors, but I trace it back to, even before I was here. I would go back all the way to 2009. Scripps closed the Rocky, and that was a kind of a wake-up call to the industry. And then when Alden did some big cuts at the Denver Post, and there was what's been termed the Denver Post Rebellion, and that's what the Colorado Sun spun out of. That was a second wake-up call. And I think the groundwork was kind of laid that we can't just keep doing business as usual, and we need to collaborate and work together. Maybe there was a little bit of that Coloradan Midwest niceness combined with that Western independence as well, that just led people to be open to doing different things. And then when COVID hit, that's when things really kind of solidified in terms of the collaboration. So back in 2018, after that Denver Post Rebellion, the Colorado Media Project spun up, which was originally a project out at DU, the University of Denver. And then the Gates Family Foundation funded it. And that's a big part of what's gone on in the ecosystem. So they've become a funder roundtable. They're now the home of Press Forward Colorado. Press Forward's this big national campaign to get philanthropic dollars into local news. And so they've really helped push the industry forward. And they and the Press Association helped fund Colorado News Collaborative, or better known as Collab, with Laura Frank. And when that started right at when the pandemic hit. So they started doing COVID diaries and some collaborative reporting around that. And all these things just kind of kept snowballing to kind of make this one of the more interesting ecosystems in the country.
Yeah, it is. It's just funny. I started leaning more into this industry. I'm like, oh, interesting. It's all kind of like right here around me. I'm on the western slope, so not as much activity out here, but still, it's really interesting to see. And then also with the Press Forward initiative, I do a newsletter too, and I was just finishing it up this morning for tomorrow. And they kind of just announced I think it was 200 plus newsrooms just got funding, and I think somebody in every state. Do you know, just out of curiosity, who got it here in Colorado, or how many newsrooms?
9 newsrooms in Colorado
wow.
got it. So we are definitely punching above our weight because an average of 4 got it across for each state.
And we're not in the highest, population density states
right,
by a long shot. Very cool.
And then there were a number of newsrooms on the western slope, by the way, that got it.
Were there?
Yeah.
Huh. I'm gonna have to look into that. I was literally just looking at it this morning, and it was like the press release from Press Forward, so they didn't mention all 200 individually of who was on there. That's awesome. It's very cool stuff happening. So you host a podcast too, the Local News Matters podcast, which is kind of similar to this one in the local media space. Could you talk about that? Just what you, for anybody listening to this who may be interested in that podcast as well, what you talk about there and what you're doing over there, who you're talking to, et cetera.
Yeah, sure. So I started this a couple years ago, more or less a side project, but I really wanted to engage leaders, both nationally, but also in local newsrooms, in conversation about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what's interesting and innovative about what they're doing. And so we cover a lot of really the business of local news and how do we respond to audiences and engage audiences and grow audiences and monetize that, whether that's through advertising or subscriptions or philanthropy. And we also talk a lot about community engagements and how do we serve the entire community and do so responsibly and ethically and not lay people out and deal with issues around mistrust and some of that, not just the result of our current polarization, but there's history, particularly with minority communities. And so we talk about big issues like that all the way down to very tactical issues of how you keep a newsroom going, financially and logistically.
Do you have any examples of, so this podcast is, it kind of delves into wherever, our conversations go, but the aim is to be about the business side and building sustainable businesses, and all things on that end. Well, what interesting stuff, are there any models, or if not like business models, just examples of people doing it really well that you've had on the show or that you've learned of through the show? I'm curious if there's any pop out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of examples of interesting work. I would say no one's got it all figured out, or they would be gobbling up all the papers and be very rich. So, I think a lot of it has to do with being willing to experiment, but also understanding your core business and, serving your audience and your customer, your advertising customers, if you're an advertising-based business. And, there's different levels of innovation. Some of it is really just kind of best practices and getting out of how the business was running 30 years ago. And I just did an interview with several academics who just put out a book earlier this year called Reviving Local News. They worked with some Midwestern small newsrooms, and one in particular in Kansas. And Terry Feynman, who's at the University of Kansas, really animated on the podcast, and this comes through in the book too. The business model that we're using in this industry was established 200 years ago. The penny press, where you basically give away a physical paper and you get lots of advertisers, and it's a very objective piece of content that doesn't offend anybody, so that you can get broad audiences and print advertisers. And we're still kind of operating at the model, not just because it's largely print advertising driven, but we haven't raised our prices. She pointed out that, the penny press was literally a penny 200 years ago. And a lot of these small rural papers, they're selling their newspaper for 89 cents. That's ridiculous. Right.
Right.
So, yeah. So a lot of the innovation that needs to happen is really not innovation in the way you would think of in Silicon Valley, but it's more about figuring out how you can reach audiences and get them to pay or get advertisers in new ways. And so it could be events, it could be different membership levels and ways for people to buy in and help contribute and that sort of thing. And now philanthropy is becoming a growing part of the mix.
I know I've been putting together this newsletter for a few months now. It's just, it's mostly a curated list of cool stories I find in the space. And I mean, it's just obvious from the amount of headlines that pop up with philanthropic support. It's a major piece, and that's great. And it's amazing it's happening, but I don't know that it's sustainable long term, to just keep counting on that money to be coming in or wherever. And also just kind of based off what you were saying, like the newsroom, the smaller Midwest newsrooms or whatever, still kind of following that old model. That's come up time and time again on this show also. And along with that, a theme of my last couple of episodes I've recorded that may not all be out by now is just how another challenge facing, so for legacy publishers that have been people that have been there for a long time, it was always like the business side and the editorial side, or there are these newer ones starting up where it's like a 1 or 2 person digital outlet, and they're doing it for all the right reasons, but it's, they're just worried about connecting with the community. And maybe there's not as strong of a business background there and building that up. So I've I've had some people on the show just talking about that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. I think the ones that I think are doing well, they tend to kind of fall into two buckets. There are ones that really are leaning into a nonprofit model and are really engaging the community. And I think it's not unwise to question the sustainability of that. But American Journalism Project's an umbrella nonprofit organization funder, really, that started a few years ago. And Sarah Berman's the head of that, and she came from Teach for America, and she pushes back hard on people who question that, because we don't question that about schools or education. That there is money there, we just need to make the case better. But the other category of companies that I think are doing well are those who really understand that, particularly in smaller towns, but it's true in any metro as well, we have long been a huge part of the business community. It's how businesses, got the word out. And if we really see our advertisers as clients, as part of our, as a real customer and someone we serve, and not just, throw pages at and say subsidize our journalism, those are the ones that I think are doing well, and they're finding new ways to serve it. So yes, they're selling print ads and digital ads, but you're not going to make a thriving business on banner ads with CPMs, right? You need to figure out new ways to partner with them and help them market.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of got to be a multi-pronged approach, or I don't know how to say it, just like some creativity and figuring out the mix. And who did I have on recently? I've done a bunch of interviews in the last 2 weeks, and some of them kind of blurring together. I think it was Chris Cruson from Lion Publishers, the executive director over there. I think it was him, I may be misquoting this, who said that kind of some of their data showed, when they did all their audits of these local things, that the publishers that were doing the best had between 2 and 6 revenue streams. So if they just had one, below 2, it was quite a struggle. But if they were doing every single thing in the world, 7 or more, it was not working either. And I just thought it was really interesting. It's one of those things that data would show, but you wouldn't think of it intuitively. So that's kind of where that leads me with that, just kind of experimenting like that. And that's why things like collab and everything are so cool. You talked about advertising also just now. And so you said one of the legs that the Colorado Press Association has is selling the advertising in, for these major players. So I'm curious, because I'm just based off your LinkedIn, and you may have said this, you kind of came on board right in the midst of the pandemic as the CEO there. So you've been there for a very interesting couple of years,
Definitely.
to say the least. I'm just curious what you're seeing, let's just say from the mid-pandemic through the crazy, frothy boom, in the markets and everything, and kind of a bit of a crash now. What are these bigger, say the XL Energies of the world? I don't know how to say what I'm trying to ask. What are they looking for? What's changed with what they're trying to do now and how they're trying to advertise? I'm curious.
Yeah. Print advertising still drives a huge proportion of the revenue for the industry. Digital is growing, but it's still very much dependent on print, especially in the smaller towns. And it varies widely. I think the latest numbers from Burrell, which is an industry group that really surveys local advertising, they're projecting some growth in print. It's minor, but growth. But it's been declining, and the pandemic certainly didn't help. But it did come back from when the pandemic hit, it was basically it all disappeared. The whole advertising sector, digital and print, basically was put on pause for a brief period. And so, we do have a crisis of local news, and newspapers are disappearing, but not at the rate that you might have thought heading into the pandemic. That a lot of these, even the small, maybe particularly the small rural papers, have held on, but it's a struggle day to day. And a lot of the big advertisers in particular have really cut back on their print. Excel, for example, is still doing print ads, but I think it's a little bit less a lower level than it used to be. And I think that's what you see a large part. I think the advertisers that are in print see good returns and are happy with their results. It's really hard to get new advertisers in and convince them because of just sort of the stigma that everybody, a lot of people see this as a dying thing. But I think, I think it's proven surprisingly resilient, and I think, it's going to be around for a while. And as you know, in a mountain town, sometimes those print papers are really valued. Usually they're weekly and not daily, although there are exceptions. And so it's a different pace, and it gives you something that stands out from just, going to a website, and particularly if it's something you perceive as just somebody's blog. And a lot of advertisers value that, and they get some longevity to being in print. I mean, how many ads do you actually click on, banner ads or even Facebook and Google ads?
Right. Yeah. I guess they're working for somebody, but yeah, that's a good question. I scroll right on by. It's interesting kind of what you were saying, what you've seen from the bigger, I wonder how much of the struggle is just the narrative around it. Like, oh, local news, this debt. Because like I say all the time, like if you look at Google Trends over the last 20, 30 years, nothing wanes with people looking for local information and everything It's just like the old model doesn't work the way it used to. So once again, back to what we were kind of saying before, just cracking that code, or if there is a code to be cracked. I've been doing the podcast more and more. I've been becoming more convinced that it's just more of a very localized thing. Like each community is so much different. Is kind of what it's turning into, which I mean, could be a good thing. It's not going to go back to the way it was before, but that's what I've been seeing from just talking to people smarter than myself on this podcast. And so I didn't have this in the notes, but so you said a lot of the smaller, more rural publishers have remained surprisingly resilient. I did see, sorry, I'm just like combating what you're saying. So I read Corey Hutchins' newsletter. Do you know Corey? And there was like kind of a wave of small publishers, kind of almost like a little collapsing event out on the eastern plains of Colorado. For anybody not familiar, everybody thinks of mountains, but the whole eastern side of the state is farms and the Great Plains, basically. Do you know what's going on with that? And sorry to surprise you with that question. I didn't have it in my notes before, but it's kind of concerning.
Yeah, I mean, earlier this year, I think there were 3 papers that went under pretty close proximity, which prompted that. And it's struggle. It's day to day for a lot of these places. At least one of those papers was part of a chain, and that's kind of a different beast because they have different things they're looking for, in terms of the financial metrics, and sometimes they think they can keep some of the audience with a paper that's maybe close by. And so I almost treat that in a separate bucket because that's not, the community-owned paper. And so the financials are just very different, the considerations. But yeah, particularly, it depends a lot of times on how healthy is the business community, in that area, and how much are they willing to support a local paper. But, one of those papers that closed, we had something crop up, actually I think it had already existed and it kind of stepped up and is doing a lot more business and more local coverage. So yeah, it's certainly not a rosy picture all across the board. But if you had asked me, even pre-pandemic, to go back 10 years ago in 2014, if I thought we'd still have, 100 and plus, small papers, rural papers in print in Colorado, I would have said, no, there's no way. And so, most of them have held on. Yeah, but it is a concern. I haven't read it yet, but just today, Northwestern's local news report came out, and so I haven't seen what.
Nice.
Yeah, so I haven't seen what it says, how many closures there are, but they've been ringing the alarm bell for quite a while.
Yeah, it's great. That's a great report that comes out every year. Yeah, and that's interesting. So I'm just getting more curious here, and not to drag us down to Colorado local issues thing or anything. I'm just curious, and this may be nothing, but so I would imagine the towns out on the eastern part of the state, it's just like there's not as much, like you said, business activity going on out there. I've been through there. It's kind of a sparsely populated, really tiny towns type thing. So one issue, and I'm curious if you've seen this, once again, maybe nothing. Another issue in Colorado is the mountain, the ski towns, in terms of just like the real estate markets and everything have absolutely exploded in recent years, to the point where I live an hour north of Telluride, which is a famous ski resort. And the people that work the lifts and the restaurants there can't afford to live within like 30 miles of there because a 2,000 square foot bungalow costs $3 million, in decent shape or something like that. So I just can't. Does any of that echo in the local news space that you from your seats? I'm just taking my time to pick your brain about these things now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a huge problem. In particular, a lot of these small rural papers were family owned, and the owners are, getting ready to retire, and their kids don't want to take it over. And so attracting new talent is a huge issue. And, sometimes it could be hard to get people to move to smaller towns. I mean, Telluride's great. I'm sure lots of people would love to live there, but getting them to move across the country or something can be hard. And then when you factor in the cost of living, and I've even heard that from Eastern Plains folks. I mean, it's a whole different level of cost.
Yeah.
But what, the pay is also, the pays in the mountain towns aren't commiserate, but they're still more than what they can afford to pay on the Eastern Slope. And housing has gone up pretty much all over the state.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge in every industry. So we were in Golden for years until 2019, just before the pandemic. My wife and I moved out to Montrose. And my wife actually got a job with, I might not keep her employer in the podcast, but that's okay. I might edit that part out. As a in the finance department. And that was a huge challenge. To this day is keeping talent and recruiting talent. It's an ongoing issue. So that's, I don't think I've asked anybody that question about the local news industry. And, since I know Colorado, that you'd be a good person to ask. So that's interesting.
Even getting interns, because they need housing for the summer. And that if they're getting paid at all, it's certainly not enough to keep a place in Vail for the summer.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing with the ski towns is, I could imagine a small, just rural town, like a young person out of school or an intern doesn't want to go there. It's just like, some boring town. But the ski towns are incredibly attractive to a certain kind of person. And if you're outdoors, you don't want to ski, they're amazing places, but just that cost is like untenable. And there's also a lot of blowback. I won't get too deep in the weeds here, but there's also a lot of blowback on Airbnb and VRBO and everything, causing the housing shortage and everything too. So I won't go down that road too much more though. Thanks for humoring me though on that. It's interesting. Excellent. Awesome. Well, Tim, I think we've gotten through all my questions. What else have I missed? What else would you like to get out to my audience or maybe another podcast audience that may like your show, or any other pressing things in your mind that we've talked about that we could go deeper on?
Maybe a couple things. One is part of that sustainability mix throughout the country. Different associations and groups and individual newsrooms are starting to look to government. This used, even a few years ago, is something that a lot of people would have just not even considered. They would have just written it off as a terrible idea. But that's changed pretty dramatically. So we've had some big initiatives at the national level, and a number of states have had initiatives to in some way help fund newsrooms, and that looks like a lot of different things. California just did a tax on big tech. Some of that's going to newsrooms. So I think citizens should think about that. There are certainly lots of issues with that, but it is a public good and it is a community resource. And we've certainly seen in Canada and England the good work that publicly supported journalism can do. Again, not easy. How you distribute that? How do you maintain independence? But I think it's something worth considering. And then I think local businesses and consumers need to think about their local newsrooms and how they can support them, and both financially, but also just engage with them and tell them what you want to see, and don't just be an armchair critic.
Yeah, that's great. And the government support thing, the blowback I've seen on that is basically what you said. Especially in a country like the U.S., where we have our First Amendment and everything. And I know there's concerns from some people over where does it end? Or there's there influence from the government? And even if there isn't, it's like an optics thing. You know what I mean? It would have to be, I'm just spitballing here, but it would just have to be very transparent. I feel like that there's no,
absolutely,
here's the check, hands off. I don't know how you do that. Once again, there may be smarter people out there than me to figure that out. But I mean, that is, talk about a behemoth for bringing in, new funding and supporting the public good. And yeah, so that's great stuff. Awesome. Tim, I won't take up too much more of your time. Thank you very much for coming on here. Where can people find you, and anything else you'd like to share? The Press Association, your podcast, where should people go to follow you and find out more?
For the Press Association, just coloradopressassociation.com, and that's primarily a website for newsrooms, but you can see what we're up to. And then for the podcast, it's Local News Matters podcast.com or LNMpod, LNMpod.com. And, we're on all the platforms, Apple, Spotify, etc.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it. And I will talk to you later. All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Small Press Big Ideas. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to help the show, the best thing you can do is to tell a friend or colleague and just take a few minutes to leave a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to right now. It only takes a minute out of your day, but it really does help the podcast grow and reach more ears. Check back for new episodes every Monday.